Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. A couple of announcements before I introduce our guests for today. On next Tuesday, April 7th, April 6th, we'll be talking about Ernest Hemingway, and that is connected to the April 5 PBS documentary, which is in 3 parts, another Ken Burns series about Ernest Hemingway. And so we will have Hemingway expert Dr. Verna Kale from Penn State University with us on the 6th at noon for our Lunch with Books, and we'll talk about the first episode. She was interviewed for the documentary and has written a book about Hemingway. So join us next week for that. Remember today, if you ask a question, you'll be entered into a drawing to win Dr. Joseph's book, The Sword and the Shield, which I'm holding here. So ask away and just type in your comments and we'll get to them at the end. Peniel E. Joseph is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and Professor of History and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a frequent national commentator on issues of anti-racism, democracy, and civil rights. He's written several books on African American history, including The Sword and the Shield, which you're going to hear about today, which was Time Magazine's 100 must-read books of 2020. And here is Dr. Peniel Joseph.
Hi, thank you. What I'd like to start with is why I wrote the book. A lot of people are always saying, what makes you interested in writing these books? I've always been interested in American history, in African American history. I became a historian because of my mother, who's 81 years young, still in New York City. And she was my first history teacher, my first social justice teacher, feminist, and taught me about Haitian history, African American history, Caribbean history as well. And so I've been really deeply invested in the civil rights struggle, both as a scholar, but also as a participant as well in New York City, on picket lines since I was in elementary school. And in a lot of ways, this book, The Sword and the Shield, is really a culmination of my previous work on the Black Power movement, the civil rights movement. I did a biography of Stokely Carmichael. I did a book on Black Power and Barack Obama. I edited some anthologies on the Black Power movement as well, and written numerous essays and op-eds related to this period. But I was always struck by the way in which Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were framed in historical scholarship. Most scholarship, and certainly the public imagination, frames them as really dualities, whereas King is this nonviolent American apostle of peace. Malcolm X is portrayed as this avenging warrior, this avenging angel, and even the metaphor in the book's title, The Sword and the Shield, is really a pushback against that. We think of Malcolm X as the political sword and King as the nonviolent shield. And what I argue in The Sword and the Shield is that they both represent both of those things, both aspects of the sword and the shield throughout their political careers. And by braiding their lives together, I argue that through a dual political and intellectual biography, we get a much better sense of the radical and revolutionary politics that they both encompassed, how they evolved and changed and transformed over times, and really how the times they lived in affected them and how they affected the times that they lived in. And those times are really the post-war Black freedom struggle, if we're thinking capaciously, the civil rights Black power movements, if we're thinking about them in the context of how they're usually iterated and articulated here. But this is really part of Malcolm and Martin are part of the global decolonization, anti-colonial human rights struggles that are happening, and really a conflict between the global North and global South in the context of post-war international relations. And the United States plays an outsized role in that, and for good reason. The United States talked about democracy during the Second World War. Black activists talked about a double V campaign: victory against fascism abroad and victory over Jim Crow white supremacy at home. So when we think about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., they really are connected to panoramic notions and natures of struggle. I think the best thing to do is start with the beginning a little bit. When we think about King and Malcolm, they are both born in the 1920s. Malcolm X is born on May 19th, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. And Malcolm is going to be one of 8 children. He's the son of 2 Black activists, Louise Norton Little and Earl Little. They are Garveyites, followers of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who's the Jamaican Pan-Africanist who comes to the United States in 1916 and really helps to mobilize the largest mass Black movement in history. 3 to 5 million folks are part of the Garvey movement. It's a movement for political self-determination. It's not just in the United States, it's also in the Caribbean, in Africa, it's in South America, in Canada. So it's really this extraordinary movement. And what Garveyites do is really talk about political self-determination. Some are entrepreneurs, some are organizers, some are conservatives politically and liberal politically, others are radical socialist, Marxist, feminists. So it's really quite a capacious movement, but it's a movement that's talking about Black dignity and citizenship. Sometimes we call it the Back to Africa movement because Garvey had a shipping line and 3 different ships. He was trying to set up trade between Africa and America. Garveyism is really going to continue, even though Marcus Garvey is going to be arrested and deported. J. Edgar Hoover, early iteration before the FBI, really hires the first Black federal agent to spy on Garvey. And they really charge Garvey with mail fraud, trumped up charges that are unethical and should have been illegal. But so it goes with Black freedom struggles and law enforcement at the federal level and the state and the local level historically. When we think about Malcolm X, Malcolm's father is killed when Malcolm is 6 years old. Malcolm always thinks that his father is killed by white supremacists. The family had been harassed by white supremacists. They were farmers. They a lot of times lived in predominantly white areas. So there was friction. This is during the Jim Crow Midwest. They lived in Nebraska, in Wisconsin, and then Lansing, Michigan. Malcolm's mother is going to be institutionalized at an early age. Malcolm's going to be a foster child. He's going to be precocious, very smart, but he's also going to be a juvenile delinquent between the ages of 12 and 20, from Lansing, Michigan, all the way to living with his half-sister, LMA Collins, in Roxbury, Boston, and also going to Harlem. Malcolm's going to be known as East Lansing Red and Detroit Red for his red hair and freckles. Malcolm looks nothing like Denzel Washington for people who've seen the Denzel Washington movie, much more so like the actor who portrays him in One Night in Miami, Kingsley Ben-Adir, and his size as well is about 6'3", 6'4". And when we think about Malcolm X, Malcolm Little is going to be transformed into Malcolm X via an almost 7-year stint in prison between 1946 and 1952. And he's going to become part of the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam is interesting because they are really an offshoot of the Garvey movement. They are religious Black nationalists who believe in an unorthodox vision and version of Islam. But Malcolm's going to be a Muslim for the rest of his life. He's going to take the Hajj pilgrimage in 1964, but he begins practicing in 1949. And he's going to become a debater in prison. He's going to become a self-taught intellectual in prison. And when we think about Malcolm X, while Dr. King is undergoing formal education, Malcolm X is an autodidact. He's brilliant, really a political and intellectual genius in a lot of ways. but it's going to have a much different experience than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So Malcolm's experiences in the bowels of urban America are really going to transform his politics. He's going to be the boldest critic of white supremacy, really of the 20th century, who becomes a statesman over time. Malcolm's going to argue for radical Black dignity. And by that, he means self-determination politically, the recognition of Black humanity, yes, anti-racism, but even more. Malcolm argues that Black people are only going to get racial justice in the United States by eradicating white supremacy and also uplifting Africa. So there's really a Pan-Africanist and third world revolutionary bent to Malcolm X's politics. And unlike Dr. King, Malcolm is really going to serve as Black America's prosecuting attorney. He is prosecuting white America for a series of crimes that date back to racial slavery. One of the most extraordinary aspects of doing the research of on this book was being able to not just read speeches by Malcolm and Dr. King, but to be able to listen to as many speeches as possible that they gave over the course of their political careers. For Malcolm, it's between 1952 and 1965. For King, it's between 1955 and 1968. And Malcolm's constantly talking about racial slavery, not just the house Negro versus field Negro. Very, very famous speech where he's saying that, basically accusing civil rights folks, including Dr. King, of being Uncle Toms, but he's making a distinction about class in the Black community, that going back to racial slavery, there were field Negroes who he defines himself as, and there were house Negroes who were really always ready to accommodate and capitulate to white supremacy so that they could survive and get more access. So when we think about this idea of Black dignity, Malcolm argues that Black dignity resides in the last place Black people might ever care to look, which is in their own traditions, which is in their own histories. Malcolm really distills the pain, the trauma, but also the defiant joy and the rhythms of being Black to Black folks themselves. Malcolm has a lacerating sense of humor. Malcolm famously says that you can't put a knife 9 inches in a person's back and pull it out 6 inches and call that progress. So Malcolm really pushes back against what we might define as the progress of the heroic period of the civil rights movement. My last statement on Malcolm before switching to King is that from Malcolm X's perspective, when Little Rock Central High School is desegregated in 1957, that is not a positive thing. And the reason it's not positive is not because Malcolm X is a racial segregationist. He's not. He's a racial separatist. He's not pleased with Little Rock because there's a mob of 1,500 maniacal white people, white supremacists, right? Including white people who might think of themselves as religious. They might think of themselves as good people. They were not. They were screaming at Black folks, kids, who were trying to desegregate Little Rock Central High School, and the military had to escort them. For Malcolm, this is an astonishing display of white people's inhumanity and the evils of Jim Crow segregation. There are no victory laps when we have to escort children into public schools. So Malcolm is saying that the United States is an irredeemably sick society. And when you look at the footage of Little Rock Central High School, Malcolm X is absolutely right. That is not anything to take a victory lap from. And the sit-in movements are the same thing. So when we think about this, it's important for us to understand, well, why is Malcolm X so disturbed? Malcolm X is so disturbed about white supremacy because he cares about Black people. He believes Black lives matter, and he's not trying to debate white people over that matter. He's not trying to debate the idea of Black humanity. And that's very important for us to remember. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has a different experience and a different childhood. January 15th, 1929. He's born in Atlanta, Georgia. Sweet Auburn Avenue. He's the son of one of the biggest, most prominent ministers, Martin Luther King Sr., in the United States. And Ebenezer Baptist Church is now the pulpit of the first Black senator elected from the state of Georgia, Reverend Raphael Warnock, who presides over Dr. King's pulpit. And so when we think about Dr. King has a different experience. It doesn't mean he doesn't face racism, but Dr. King goes to Morehouse College. While Malcolm X is in prison from 1946 to 1952, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is finishing up his undergraduate studies at Morehouse College. He finishes 3 years as part of an interracial seminary class at Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. And he begins PhD studies at Boston University, which he completes in 1956 in religion. And so Malcolm X has a different experience than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In a lot of ways, Dr. King is going to be reading the Black social gospel. He's going to be trained by folks like Benjamin Mays, the president of Morehouse. He's listening to Howard Thurman. He's reading Gandhi. He's reading Marx. He's reading Reinhold Niebuhr. He's reading Paul Tillich. But his sentiments as a political activist are going to be much more towards reform, King is going to be talking about Black citizenship in contrast to Malcolm's notion of Black dignity. And for Dr. King, that notion of citizenship is much more than just voting rights. King is going to argue that citizenship encompasses food justice, it encompasses decent housing. Yes, it encompasses voting rights, but it also encompasses my daughter in school. So what Dr. King is talking about with radical Black citizenship is decent housing, a universal basic income, the end of segregation in public schools and neighborhoods, and really a much more capacious vision of citizenship, not just the end of racial oppression and racial violence, but the visible appearance of justice. Now, what my book really talks about in detail, and we can get into in the Q&A, is over time, both King and Malcolm, they start off as rivals who become adversaries, who become really each other's alter egos over time. The book starts off with their only meeting on March 26, 1964, at the US Senate building while folks are filibustering the 64 Civil Rights Act. And both Malcolm and Martin are in Washington, D.C. in support of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is going to desegregate public accommodations and really is going to do a lot more. You know, race and gender are going to become protected classes. When we think about in terms of the federal government, it's going to be a game changer, even though we're not going to see voting rights until the next year. What's extraordinary between 1955, when they're really both on the same stage, to 1965 is going to be the evolution of both. Over time, they're going to come to see that you actually need Black dignity and citizenship to try to transform American democracy, to try to end systemic racism, to try to transform racial capitalism. Both of them were critics of the way in which capitalism was not only racist, but promoted violence structurally, promoted inequality, promoted segregation. So what's really extraordinary is the journey they both take and how they come to understand each other better over time. Even though Malcolm had famously called King an Uncle Tom, he famously says the March on Washington is nothing but a farce on Washington. He comes to have a real respect for King and vice versa, really in their lifetimes. By 1964, Malcolm X is telling the journalist and the novelist Robert Penn Warren that him and Martin Luther King Jr. have the same goals, and those goals are human dignity. By 64, in addition to meeting at the US Senate, Malcolm is sending King telegrams, He publicly apologizes to civil rights leaders who he's criticized. He takes 2 trips to Africa. His first trip had been in 1959, but he takes 2 further trips to Africa, spends about 25, 26 weeks there, takes the Hajj pilgrimage, and starts to say that white people who are sincere can be part of a radical movement for human rights. He argues that the civil rights movement should be considered a human rights movement. And in December of 1964, Malcolm X actually sits down in Harlem and listens to Dr. King give a speech. And this is the second time he heard King speak. He was at the March on Washington, at least in his hotel room in Washington, D.C. And King has just won the Nobel Peace Prize in December of 64. And he's back and he's talking about his travels and his experiences. And Malcolm actually really is sitting next to Andrew Young, who's one of King's lieutenants, and is very, very laudatory of that speech a few days later in Harlem. And then finally, in February of 1965, Malcolm X tries to visit Dr. King in Selma, Alabama. King is in prison, and instead Malcolm is able to meet up with Andy Young again, and also Coretta Scott King. He tells Dr. King's wife, and really his main political partner, that he's there to help, that he respects and admires Dr. King, and he wants people to see that there's an alternative if Dr. King's methods fail. And we also see throughout 1964, Malcolm X's speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. And this is a speech that, in a very overt way, says that Black voting rights have to be respected, or there's going to be even more racial violence, because there was racial violence anyway, and the violence was cutting across multiple ways. There was the structural violence of racial segregation and economic poverty, but then there was the physical violence of police brutality. And the urban rebellions of the 1960s, what some people call riots or civil disturbances, really start in the South in 1963 in Birmingham, and then you're going to get Harlem and Brooklyn and New Jersey and Newark and Los Angeles and Detroit and other places that go really all the way up into the early 70s, although we look at it from 64 to 68. Very quickly, I want to talk about King and how Malcolm influences Dr. King before opening it up to questions. When we think about Dr. King, my last 2 chapters are on the radical king and the revolutionary king. And this happens after Malcolm's assassination. Malcolm is, of course, assassinated in New York City on February 21st, 1965. People are still doing investigations on that assassination. Certainly, New York Police Department had informers in Malcolm's coteries. So did the FBI. People usually say the Nation of Islam sent assassins to kill him, but certainly law enforcement was aware of what was happening, did nothing to stop it, and had actually contributed to the climate of violence that led to Malcolm X's assassination. When we think about Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, starting in 1965, is going to become increasingly dissatisfied with the Great Society and the political reforms that he had actually helped broker and negotiate previously. So it's very interesting. What we're going to see with King in 66, 67, 68 is a King who sounds much more like Malcolm X. It's a King who is marching arm in arm with Stokely Carmichael and Black Power radicals. It's a King who's unleashed in terms of talking about the depth and breadth of white supremacy. King is saying that the halls of the US Congress are running wild with racism. King says that the United States is a sick society, sick with the cancer of racism, and that he's being criticized, but he's like the physician who just diagnoses the illness, and he didn't start the disease. King accuses all white people of being racist publicly in his speeches, that they have conscious or unconscious racism. King says that white people by 1967 are saying there'd be racial peace, but for the violence that they are causing and lying about. So this is a brand new Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is the king who's really fully embraced the Old Testament prophetic tradition that he had often talked about when we think about prophets like Jeremiah or Amos, where justice rolls down like a mighty stream. So King is a pillar of fire in the last several years of his life, but he really announces himself as a political revolutionary on April 4th, 1967, where he repudiates the Johnson administration, but he also repudiates American imperialism and its regime of racial capitalism and white supremacy very, very forcefully in that speech. He says that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, and that the United States will not have the political maturity to do what needs to be done. He says that Black and white soldiers in Vietnam are murdering children, yet they can't live in the same neighborhood in Detroit in the United States. He says America is a sick nation, and it's going to require a bitter but beautiful struggle to try to transform American democracy. This isn't the king that we celebrate annually, and with good reason, because we celebrate a king who feeds the lie of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism, meaning the United States is a place where all things are possible, and we refuse to talk about settler colonialism. We refuse to talk about anti-Semitism. We refuse to talk about deep misogyny and sexual violence against women. We refuse to talk about racial slavery. We refuse to talk about the consequences of our violence against both American citizens, against immigrants, and the entire world. And instead, we feed ourselves a fairy tale about how we are the absolute best country that has ever existed on the planet Earth. King, by the end, pushes back against these lies of American exceptionalism. And remember, American exceptionalism is based on two big lies. The first lie, which is connected to racial slavery and how we got and achieved global capitalism, is that Black people and Black lives did not matter. That's the only way you could have the dehumanization of chattel slavery and the Dred Scott decision and all the things that led to the Civil War between 1861 and 1865, and the eradication of over 700,000 people in America. That death total still surpasses all the Americans who have died in subsequent wars. The second lie, and that's a lie that we tell ourselves in the United States, both in the 20th and 21st century, is that the first lie did not happen. Right? So those are extraordinary lies. And that's how American exceptionalism, even to this day, although I think January 6th and the white supremacist riot at the Capitol sort of gives proof to the lie of American exceptionalism, but that's not the first time. I think the white supremacist racial pogroms of the early 20th century in Atlanta, in Tulsa, in Elaine, Arkansas, and other places gave proof to the lie. Chicago 1919, right? And certainly when we think about the context of the 60s, the white supremacist assaults on civil rights demonstrators, white police rioting, not just in Chicago in 1968, where protesters said the whole world is watching, but in other spaces have really always given proof to that lie. But I think we've never seen such evidence of the lie about American exceptionalism than we have over the past year, which is really extraordinary. I'm going to stop here now. I got to put my daughter in a new class and then come back for questions and answers. I've got to print something out. I'll be right there.
Okay, while we wait for Dr. Joseph, I'll just remind everyone that next week our program will be about Ernest Hemingway, following up on the PBS series. And before we get to the Q&A today, joining us for that segment will be Patrick Cassidy, who's the president of the Walls Foundation here in Wheeling. And he and I will be chatting with Dr. Joseph. If you ask a question in the comments field, you'll have an opportunity to win a copy of the book, Sword in the Shield, the very fine book that he was just talking about. And we'll have a drawing when we conclude the Q&A section. So just stand by for another minute, and we'll be right back with you.
Okay, I'm back, ready for the Q&A.
Right.
It's
Welcome back.
parenting during the pandemic.
We know.
I remember the old days of school and just people dropped off and it was
Yeah.
We do it in the back room now. Yeah.
It's like Little House on the Prairie. We just have the school right here. It's just all in one. It's just the whole family's together all the time.
Yeah. Joining us, as I mentioned, is Patrick Cassidy, president. Patrick, do you have a question for Dr. Joseph?
Well, do we have any questions yet from our audience, Sean?
Okay, we have one from Bob Gaudio here. Let me put it on the screen.
No, I didn't interview Jim Brown. That's a great question. I sourced interviews. I've done, over the course of my career, a bunch of interviews for people, and some, including people who knew Malcolm and Dr. King. But for this project, I just sourced interviews besides the archival work and the secondary work. But certainly Jim Brown had a relationship with Malcolm X, and the new film, One Night in Miami, which was directed by Regina King. I think is an extraordinary film about the night, February 25th, after Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay then won the heavyweight championship over Sonny Liston, in the night that Muhammad Ali or Cassius Clay, Malcolm X, and Sam Cooke and Jim Brown spent that evening together in Miami. So there's an extraordinary movie about that everyone should check out.
Dr. Joseph, you mentioned the visit by Malcolm X to Reverend King while he was in jail, I believe, in Birmingham.
Yes.
Is that when he wrote letters from a Birmingham jail?
No. One, in terms of that February 65 visit, he's trying to visit King. It's around February 4th, 5th of 65. King is in jail. They don't meet. He gets to see Coretta, but King writes letter from Birmingham jail in April of 63. And that's a good segue in this sense that when we think about King's political radicalism, we see it early in spaces like Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he's very critical of white liberals, and who says are more interested in an unjust peace than struggles for justice that will really push back against the status quo. And I think we heard a lot of that in 2020 in the context of the George Floyd protests and uprisings about like, what are good people doing? That's what King was interested in. He was very, very critical of sort of so-called good people in ways where he said he understood the segregationists and they were battling that evil, but they were very much upfront about what they were about, right? And he was much more critical of people who he said, look, are not standing on the side of justice, even though personally they realized that racial segregation and racism was this great evil, right? This great evil, but they refused to publicly and in their own lives do anything about it. So he's early on. I think 63 is a turning point for Dr. King in a sense of he's much more willing to talk about these issues publicly. He does it in Letter from Birmingham Jail. And really a lot of the March on Washington speech, the I Have a Dream speech, is a combative speech that the rhetorical, the peroration of I Have a Dream at the end made people forget. He starts that speech off by saying, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. He says that we come here to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the great vaults of opportunity in America are bankrupt. And that's the August 28th, Wednesday, August 28th, 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom speech. And in that speech, he talks about governors in Alabama and Mississippi and their lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. That was the language of the Confederacy and white supremacy, right? He says that Alabama is a state filled with vicious racists. And he talks about Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is the rebirth of the Klan in 1915. And remember, on August 8th, 1925, 30,000 Klansmen marched in Washington, D.C., 30,000 in the nation's capital on August 8th, 1925. In a few years, we're going to be commemorating the centennial of that. So that's King in 63 is saying, this is an unbelievably racist place, and this is an unjust place. He says Mississippi is a state sweltering with the heat of oppression, sweltering with the heat of injustice, and so is Georgia. He's saying this in the speech. And in that speech, he says we're going to have to struggle together and organize together. But he also says in March on Washington speech, we're going to have to go to jail together. Anybody pursuing social justice, you only go to jail in an unjust society. If we're pursuing justice, right, we're not villains. Those of us who are saying we want to end poverty and we want to help the children and the infants, we are not the people, and we're marching nonviolently, who should be clubbed to death and placed in prison, right? That only happens in authoritarian, unjust societies, right? We usually think about Russia like that, right? The old Russia, right? Well, the new Russia too. We think about just Russia, period, like that, right? We think historically about China like that, right? King was asking us to do what? And that's the hard part. And that's why he talked about a beloved community and the revolution of values. He was asking us to look at ourselves, right? And if we looked at ourselves, we weren't going to like what we see. But his hope was that we actually had the fortitude to transform ourselves. That's why King is always optimistic in ways that at times Malcolm X is not. And it's not that Malcolm's cynical, he's more realistic. And again, they're two different people. I think what's extraordinary about King and Malcolm is how when one is in college and going to graduate school, the other one's literally in jail. You wouldn't think that these two would ever meet again or have anything in common, but they do. They're these two extraordinary people. And again, King and what he experienced represents one branch of the African-American experience, but what Malcolm experiences represents the other, right? So those two things fit. It's not one part of that experience isn't more worthy than the others. Like we have Black people in prison now, and they're not less worthy than the Black people who are professors or entrepreneurs or at Harvard or something. You know what I mean? Society might judge the two differently, but King asked us not to, right? So I think it's extraordinary to see that group come together, because usually the person who's in jail versus the person who's studying, those two never meet up again, right? They never meet. With these two, they become so important to each other, and I thought that was a incredible part of this story too.
It certainly is, and I need to follow up with, I'm inspired to hear you call the January 6th riot, insurrection at the Capitol, a white supremacist riot, and it truly was. We don't hear a lot about that in the media, but I mean, it's all surrounding voting rights.
Yes.
The issue of Trump really got an unfair deal because a lot of Blacks voted, and
Patrick, that's exactly
related to the historic.
And it's related back to what's so interesting. It goes back to Reconstruction. I'm working on a book on this period as America's third Reconstruction now. We were talking about that in the green room, but King and Malcolm were very well aware of the Reconstruction history. One anecdote about Dr. King is in '68, when he's organizing the Poor People's Campaign, he's in Marks, Mississippi, speaking to all these poor people, and he's telling them that the way they're living in Marks, Mississippi, which is the poorest zip code in the United States at the time, Quitman County, Marks, Mississippi, he says it's a crime. And that's the same language that Malcolm X used to use. But the thing that he says, Patrick, he says, gives them a history lesson about Reconstruction, the period right after racial slavery. And basically, Reconstruction is a 3-decade-long period after racial slavery. Some people just say 1863 or 1865 to 1877. That's presidential Reconstruction, but Reconstruction occurs for over 3 decades. And he gives them the story. King gives them the story, and we have the film of this, so it's great footage you can watch. He gives them the story and says that during Reconstruction, Black people were promised 40 acres and a mule for compensation for the unpaid labor. And they didn't receive the 40 acres and a mule, but their white counterparts got access to the Homestead Act, and they received, millions of acres of free land, but they also received experts who helped them cultivate the land. They received all these different things that Black folks did not receive. And he says that these are the same people telling you now to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, right? These are the same people. So he dives into that history because so much of that history is connected to King's time. And I argue that when we think about the civil rights period, that is America's second Reconstruction, its effort at Reconstruction. And so much of it is connected to our time. So we've never had, and we can see what Georgia just did. We're passing voter suppression laws all across the country. We are literally reliving the periods of the late 19th century, but it's in full Technicolor, right? With this kind of media. Right after racial slavery, we have the start of the convict lease system. And remember, slavery doesn't officially end until December of 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, right? But even within the language of the ratification, it says except in instances of punishment, right? And so we've got Ava DuVernay's brilliant The 13th documentary, but we have convict leasing and cash money bail systems as soon as that amendment is passed. So when we think about the former president and allegations of voter fraud, in the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s, there's allegations of Black voter fraud. There's allegations of all these different things because it's connected to these movements for citizenship and dignity. So we've never had just a violent, free, and nonviolent, multiracial, multicultural democracy. Like never, right? And what's extraordinary is that in our own time, we're reliving it. And that's why I talked about the myths of American exceptionalism, because what we keep telling children is and again, our children can always tell if we're lying, because we tell them to eat vegetables. If we don't eat vegetables, they know we're hypocrites and we're lying. So we've got to if we want our kids to do stuff, like my daughter eats all the vegetables because daddy eats the vegetables. That's the only reason she's eating it. So we're in the same plane, right? So they know you're lying to them. We've told everybody that the civil rights movement's a bedtime story. We won voting rights. We ended it, right? If we ended it, how come we're having what happened not just to George Floyd, but what happened at the US Capitol, where they have swastikas in 2021. So did we end anti-Semitism too? Swastikas and Confederate flags. So we keep telling the world, we're good, nothing to see here, right? And then we get exposed publicly and we're constantly humiliated and embarrassed because we don't want to tell the truth. And one thing the Bible tells us, and I can say this as an old Christian boy from New York City. The Bible tells us the truth shall set us free, and I think that's extraordinarily true. Like I can say it as a parent: don't lie to your kids. The more truth you tell them, right, the more consistent your behavior is, and they say, "Oh, this is a good thing." So if you tell them don't smoke cigarettes, you can't smoke cigarettes. You know? You tell them not to engage in bad behavior. We can't engage in bad behavior even when no one's looking, right? That's the ethical practice of parenting, right? And King calls us to do that in public. That's the whole thing. That's what, and Malcolm does too. It's saying, hey, what if we were consistent? What we say is great. Saying that we are liberty's surest guardian around the world and at home. These are beautiful sentiments. Sentiments as Declaration of Independence are beautiful. The Bill of Rights, all of it is beautiful. What do we have to do? We have to practice what we preach, right? That's all, right? And so it's really interesting that January 6th just cast in sharp relief the distance between the rhetoric, our dreams of American democracy and building the beloved community, and seeing that happened at the citadel of American democracy, that kind of violence and that kind of hatred there. And it's connected to voting rights for Black people. It's connected to citizenship and human dignity. It's connected to a democracy where, look, in a democracy, you don't win all the time, right? You know, part of why we have a democracy is that the rights of people who lose can be protected. You don't win all the time. You only win all the time in dictatorships, right? You don't win. And that's what we don't want to be in. Right? So in a democracy, you're willing to lose non-violently. We have debates and disagreements, but then we compromise. None of us win 100% all the time, which is why we shouldn't need to riot after elections. Because you say, hey, we'll get them next time, non-violently. We'll get them. We'll organize peacefully and we'll vote.
At the beginning of your book, you talk about, really, I think the only meeting between King and Malcolm X was at the Senate building.
March 26, 1964.
Right. And the reason they were there was to hear debate about the Civil Rights Bill, and it was being filibustered.
Yes.
So now there's some question about whether filibusters are related to Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, no, historically, the filibuster has been utilized to stop anti-racist legislation. You know, historically, and that's what we can say. Historically, the filibuster has been used as a tool, historically, by the Democratic Party, now by the Republican Party, to stop anti-racist legislation. And by anti-racist legislation, I mean everything from voting rights to anti-lynching bills, basically racial justice legislation. So it's been used as something to kill that, to stop it in its tracks, right? So is there a sort of this Jim Crow roots to the filibuster in terms of the way in which it's been utilized in our Congress? Yes, it has. Obviously, we can stop that if we somehow amend the filibuster, but yes, it has been used. And again, both parties have been guilty of it historically, both parties, right? The Democratic Party has been guilty of it. in the past, and now the Republican Party. And obviously, we know there was political realignment after the Civil Rights Act between the two parties. So what we think of as the modern day Republican and Democratic parties, they've switched. The Republican Party is actually the historic Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party is the historic Republican Party of anti-slavery and abolition. And sometimes even my students wonder when they read, like, what happened, like what happened to the parties, and I try to explain to them, and we can see it methodically. They switched over time because of basically over this issue of civil rights and this issue of racial justice, and we can lump immigration into that. We can lump equality for women into that. We can lump now our opposition to anti-Semitism in that. So like all of it, like those are those issues. These, we call them civil rights, but they're really human rights, dignity, citizenship issues.
Dr. Joseph, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I think you're just getting feedback.
Well, I just want to thought, we're hearing a lot of debate now whether or not the change in direction of the parties, one to the other, started with Barry Goldwater, or was it Ronald Reagan? Dick Nixon, of course, the Southern strategy maybe started with him. But what's your take on that?
I think it begins even before. I think when you go back to the New Deal, you start to get more Black voters willing to vote for the Democratic Party because of FDR and the New Deal. Even though the New Deal, there's racial discrimination within the New Deal. It's two New Deals, one for Black, one for white. It's two-tiered liberalism, I call it. But you start to see shifts in alignment as early as the 1930s. Now, you don't see those shifts necessarily at the local or the state level. So you could see Black Republican voters who are in the North who can vote. The bulk of Black people are in the South can't vote at all. But in the North, especially the 5 most populous states with Black people are sort of New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, they can vote. What you start to see is that even, Jack Kennedy gets a robust, maybe 70% of the Black vote, especially after he helps Dr. King get out of jail in 1960. And there's a new book on that, about the 10 days King is in jail in 1960 and how it changed the 1960 election. What you see with the so-called Southern strategy, Nixon isn't an innovator here. What he starts to see is that historic Democratic constituencies in places like Orange County, California, and other places are leaving the fold because of racial integration and Brown decision. Even though racial integration doesn't happen, but just the threat of racial integration in terms of public schools. And so even with Reagan, and you start to see Nixon get the landslide in 72, Reagan has a robust victory in 80, but then a landslide in 84. What we're seeing is that even at the local level, you still see, the Democratic Party is still like the party in Texas, for instance, as late as the 1980s, and Ann Richards, right? So it really takes decades for the realignment to happen at the state house level, at the municipal level. But at the federal level, what we saw, especially up until Obama, we saw there was no way to have a coalition, a popular vote coalition with people who were anti-racist until Obama in 2008 and 2012, because Clinton wins pluralities, so there when you look at Ross Perot both times and Bob Dole and George Herbert Walker Bush, if one candidate could have gotten those votes, that candidate would have defeated Clinton, both times in 92 and 96. So you really don't get these anti-racist majorities until 2008, 2012, and certainly in 2020. So what the 3 out of the last 4 presidential elections have seen is really, and I know, Patrick, you can remember this, I can remember it as a historian, what McGovern was trying to do in 72. He was trying to build a coalition of young people, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian American, indigenous, and say, what if that group of people voted, could we win? He couldn't. The coalition wasn't big enough. You still needed too many white people weren't willing to be part of that coalition. It'd be interesting as a counterfactual if we look at 1968 and Bobby Kennedy. If Bobby Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, if he could have gotten that coalition, because there were whites, including rural whites we might not think of as like anti-racist, who would have voted for Bobby Kennedy. Right. You know, so he seems like he could have gotten a coalition amassed that would have been just extraordinary in American politics. Obviously, he's assassinated. And so, you know, one of the, you know, we talk about Dr. King's assassination, which is, you know, obviously unbelievably brutal. And so is Malcolm X, so is John Kennedy. But one of the biggest what ifs in American history, political history, this would have changed the course of the nation, is if Bobby Kennedy's not assassinated.
I always thought that.
Yeah. What you know, what kind of president is he? What kind of healing does he allow to happen? And if he's president for 2 terms, what does the world become? I mean, is there a Ronald Reagan presidency if you get a Kennedy presidency from 69 to 77? I mean, probably unlikely, because the Kennedy 2-term presidency would have been a high point of American liberalism, really. Yeah.
Great. Dr. Joseph, I'm going to have to sign off here because I have a hearing starting here in federal court. But let me just say before I leave that I appreciate you, and I appreciate especially that you are a great example of an activist who is also a scholar.
Thank you.
Your activism is alive and well through your work. So I appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate you too. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Dr. Joseph, that was a fantastic presentation, and the book is great. And like I said, we're going to give a copy away. So I drew the name while we were chatting.
Oh, great.
And it's Bob Gaudio, who will, I know, read it and appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
You're the winner of the book. Get in touch and I'll get it to you. And I just want to thank you again for a great presentation and for joining us today.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you.
Okay. Everyone, next week we'll see you for Ernest Hemingway. Have a great day.